Curm fáiltes fiisiúh goléir ag an chur lethir seo maidir leis an grád acadúil nua ar bhhailinn thabhairt isteach san ollscoil agus faoin na teideal Americanach dá rólan acadúla in san ollscoil. So welcome everyone to this presentation about the introduction of the new professorial grade and also to brief on the possible introduction of American academic titles. I will start into my presentation very shortly, but before I do so, I want to introduce the people who are with me, and Josephine Hines, the Director of HR, is here to help with the Q&A afterwards, and she'll say something about how that will run. And in the background, we have Orlo O'Donovan, who is the administrator for the promotion schemes here in the university, and Michelle Nichronian in my office, who will be helping us to sift through the questions and try and bring the questions that people are asking to the fore for the Q&A afterwards. So before I go into the presentation, then I'll just ask Josephine to outline how we intend to proceed following the presentation with the Q&A.
So good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to the presentation that the Deputy President Registrar is going to go through with you this morning. Just in regard to the questions, so there is a Q&A function on the live event, so if you wouldn't mind putting whatever questions you have into that Q&A function, not the chat function, but the Q&A function, please, as we go through the presentations in the webinar this morning. It would be great if you could put your name on the questions, as we would prefer not to have the anonymous questions. It just means that it's easier for us to follow up if there's a particular question that we need to come back to an individual on. If you like any of the questions, please give it a thumbs up, and then we'll get some, that will provide us with some feedback. And you can submit your questions throughout the presentations, or you can wait until the end. Some of the questions, depending on them coming in, we'll be able to answer, you know, as we go through the presentation. Some will need further follow-up, hence why I'm asking that people will please provide their name just at the end of the questions instead of the anonymous. You will need this if you're coming in, you know, through not through outside of the university. So if you're coming in on your phone, it won't actually come up in terms of your name, so it'll produce as anonymous. So please put your name at the end of it then, if you can. Thank you.
I hope everyone can see my presentation, and I will just go through the slides and try and elaborate as much as I can in prep for the Q&A afterwards. So why a new grade? So specifically, NUI Galway is the only university in the state that A, has a specific grade called personal professor, and B, does not have the grade between senior lecturer and full professor that other universities report to the HEA as associate professor. Now, I'm asking you in this context to think in terms of the traditional titles that we've used in Ireland, and not the American titles. I'll say something about that at the end. So when we talk about associate professor, that is a grade between senior lecturer and full professor, as traditionally reported to the HEA. In all other respects, our academic grade structure, with slight variations across all 7 universities, and I will go into the detail of that, mirrors the situation in the other 6. Some of the work that's been done by the Equality Committee has suggested that this gap, this much larger gap at NUI Galway between SL and full professor, has been a contributing factor to the lack of progression of female academics to senior roles. And so in order to illustrate exactly what that is about and what that gap is, what I'm going to now show you is effectively the academic structure and the pay data in each of the 7 universities here in the Republic. And when I say 7 universities, I mean prior to the introduction of the technological universities. That's a very different structure, and I wouldn't be looking to compare us with that. So this has all been lifted from the relevant universities' websites in the last couple of days, and they are the grades that were effective on the 1st of October 2020 and therefore are current. So at NUI Galway, what we have is the established professor grade, which is in the salary range 120 to 154, and there are 6 points on it. We uniquely have the personal professor, which is a single point grade, and it sits slap bang in the middle of established professor. It is there for a full professor, but with no progression through points or anything. You're there at the start and you're there at the end of the personal professor grade. We don't have what is traditionally called associate professor grade. That is missing. And then we have senior lecturer, which is an 8-point scale ranging from 71 to 99. Lecturer above the bar, which is a 5-point scale ranging from 67 to 86. So you can see there's overlap there. And then lecturer below the bar, which is an 11-point scale going from 44 to 61. And there is no overlap with lecturer above the bar there. And you will see as we go through the universities that there are variations on that 8, 5 and 11 in other universities, even though actually broadly speaking it's the same kind of structure, except up at the personal professor and AP grade. So moving next to UCD, they have a full professor, 6 points, same salary range as us. The PP grade does not exist. And then they have what they simply call professor, and that is the missing grade here in Galway. And that is a salary range of 88k to 116k and a 6-point scale. The senior lecturer that they have is 71 to 99, and you will see that that is the same as ourselves and an 8-point scale. Lecturer above the bar, they have a 7-point scale rather than 5 points that we have, and it goes lower. So it's 54 to 86, it stops at the same top range, but it overlaps with lecturer below the bar, which also at UCD goes lower than us, but stops at the same top point, which is 61k, and it's a 14-point scale. So we have effectively removed the bottom 2 points at lecturer above the bar and the bottom 3 points from the UCD scale at lecturer below the bar back in the mists of time. If we move on to UCC, you will see that the professor is the same as in all the universities, 120 to 154. The PP grade does not exist. They have a professor that is equivalent to AP, but it's also a 6-point scale, but it's on 102 to 119k, and it is an outlier in that regard. As we'll see, it's the only university that does that specifically. Then senior lecturer, 8-point scale, same as us. Lecturer above the bar, 67k to 86k on a 5-point scale, and I think that's pretty well the same as us. But then at lecturer below the bar, they mirror UCD. They have a 14-point scale going further down. If we look at Maynooth, professor, same as everyone else, 6-point scale. PP grade does not exist. Then they have a thing called Professor B, which is the missing grade here in Galway, and their salary scale is the same as UCD's for that. Senior lecturer, they have an 8-point scale, same as us, same as UCD. At lecture, they have a 7-point scale, which is 55 to 86k, so that's a couple of points at the bottom end of the scale additional to what we have. And then they have an assistant lecturer, which is the 14-point scale that you see in UCC, for example. And then they have this thing called a junior lecturer, which seems to sit somewhere within assistant lecture, and I haven't delved into what the ins and outs of that are, but it wouldn't be something that we would propose introducing. So if you leave the junior lecture to one side, their system mirrors the UCD one. If you then look at TCD, you have something similar. The professor is exactly the same, 6-point scale. The associate professor, as they call it, which is the missing grade, is exactly the same as in Maynooth and UCD in terms of scales. The senior lecturer there is a 6-point scale rather than an 8-point scale, so they have eliminated the bottom 2 points in the scale there compared to everyone else. And then they have a title called lecturer, which they have integrated. It's curious the way it's listed on their website, but it does have a bar in it at 61k, which is exactly where everyone else progresses from below the bar to above the bar. And they have some new integrated scale, which I haven't gone into, but in terms of the scale, their website's a bit more complicated, but then it is Trinity, I suppose. But they have a bar at 61k, exactly where we have the lecture below the bar progressing to a lecture above the bar. So effectively, it's pretty well the same scheme as system as UCD and Maynooth. If we look at DCU, full professor, what they call Professor C, 6-point scale, exactly the same as with everyone else. And those are variations, by the way, within a few pounds or a few euros. In some of the universities, it's 20 euro less or 30 euro more over the year, but it's always 120 to 154. Like everywhere else except Galway and DCU, the personal professor grade does not exist. The associate professor grade is exactly the same as at Maynooth, at Trinity, at DCU in terms of the number of points and the salary scale. And then they have senior lecturer, lecturer above the bar, lecturer below the bar, and they are broadly similar but a little bit different with many more points in the scale, 9, 9 and 10. And as we'll see, UL is almost the same as DCU, and I suspect that at senior lecturer and lecture scale, those differences, which I don't think need trouble us here, but those differences probably go back to the legacy of when they were National Institutes of Higher Education and before they became universities. You'll see there that that is almost exactly at UL what DCU has. So the commonality that you have here is that NUI Galway has a PP grade, which is a massive leap up for from SL, whereas everyone else has an associate professor grade, which is an interim between senior lecturer and full professor. And fundamentally, the proposal, therefore, is that we simply fall into line with the rest of the Irish sector. So the change that would result from that, therefore, is if you look on the left here, you have the current structure at NUI Galway, and we have established and personal professors, but no AP grade. And then senior lecturer, lecturer above the bar, lecturer below the bar. There is no change proposed whatsoever to 3, 4 and 5. But what we propose is that the established professor would become the promotional grade rather than personal professor, and that we would introduce the grade that is missing here at this university, but which every other university has, and we would do that on the same basis that all of the universities but one currently do, in order to fall into line with the broad sector. I don't know what the reason for Cork being an exception is, but I am trying to investigate that. So in terms of the new grade and how we would pitch it, the standard of achievement required would be exactly halfway between SL and full professor. As with the rest of the new promotional scheme, an applicant is not required to be at any particular level in order to apply. So it's not an additional hoop to jump through, which I think was an initial fear expressed to us, because if you're SL, even if we have this grade, you can skip over, you can apply for full professor. In fact, if you're a lecturer below the bar and you think your CV merits it, you can apply for any higher grade in the entire university that you like. That was one of the innovations in the current promotional scheme that was introduced last year, and that would remain. In some universities, there is evidence, and this is one of the dangers that we are very alert to. In some universities, there is evidence that the long-established AP grade has become the likelier grade for female applicants, and we will monitor this carefully, and we will take corrective action if a similar pattern emerges. And then the final point there is that the standards will be subjected to an external equality assessment, and I've set that in train with the Equality Office just in the last few days following a meeting with the unions last week. In terms of the personal professor and established professor, then no further appointments would be made to the title of personal professor. The title of established professor would become the promotional grade to replace it. The criteria to be used for EP will be the ones currently used for PP. Okay, so that's an important point to note. It will be the same criteria as currently used for PP, with only a slight enhancement of the leadership requirement, in line with the benchmarking of this salary many years ago, by the way, when it was benchmarked against the civil service grades, I think back in the noughties. And current personal professors, if they wish to become an established professor, will have the opportunity to apply under the promotion scheme, but they cannot automatically convert, and I think that's because of pension rights, which of course rest with the state now, but Josephine may be able to clarify that in the Q&A. So there'll be a discussion around all of that shortly, but that is all that I have to say about that. You will have noticed in some of those pay scales that they referenced titles that are different to ours, associate professor and Trinity title professor and all that kind of thing. That's to do with American grades. So I'm going to briefly talk about that, and then we'll take a combined Q&A. So noting that some Irish universities have introduced the optional use of US academic titles, many colleagues have raised the question as to whether this should be possible here at NUI Galway. It has been agreed at UNT level that we should consult with academic colleagues in this proposal, and this session outlines the nature of what is proposed in response to the request to make American titles available. Some key points: no existing contract would change. No salaries would change. The use of American titles would be an option for current staff. The use of US titles would be subject to agreed equivalencies. And I'm open to discussion around this because I know there are various views on this, and this is part of the reason for this briefing, that we have exactly that discussion. The proposed equivalencies are as follows. Lecturer below the bar and lecturer above the bar are assistant professor. Senior lecturer would be called associate professor. And as a consequence of this latter equivalence, the new professorial grade outlined already would simply be called professor. And then above that, you would have established professor. And a referendum will be initiated next week on the subject. So I now open it for discussion and hopefully clarification if anyone is not clear what is being proposed, or any questions that you may have. And I think in those terms, I will stop sharing my screen. And how do I do that? Or maybe Dave, you can stop sharing my screen there and put Josephine and myself up so that we can take the questions.
I might come in here, Paul, and there's a question up there from Lee Riley, and I think Orla has responded, but is it proposed that the personal professor is replaced by associate professor? What happens to all current personal professors? Thanks, Niamh.
Yeah, so all current personal professors remain personal professors. There is no change whatsoever for anyone's current contract or title or anything like that. At professorial level. So personal professors remain personal professors. If they wish to apply to become established professors, they can, but they certainly would not become associate professors, no.
Great, thanks, Paul. Another one in here from Tom Acton, and what is the proposed implementation date for the new grades? Thanks, Tom.
So we are currently engaging with the unions, but the intention is that this would be introduced at the end of August, so for the next promotions round. And I think it's important that we do this. We have talked about this for a number of years. It was in our original Athena Swan submission. I think we needed to get the new promotion scheme bedded down before introducing any changes to it. But the intention is that we will bring it in for the end of August this year, so the next round.
Okay, great. And the next one down is from Ursula Connolly in Law, and she's asking, in terms of the point about the potential gender pitfalls of the AP grade rather than monitor, shouldn't we put in place some safeguards against this? If other universities have had this experience already, shouldn't we take the lessons from those universities? Good point.
Yeah, it is a good point, and we will certainly consult in terms of what lessons and what safeguards you can put in place. And we are having a quality assessment done on the scheme to try and make sure that we avoid those pitfalls. Bear in mind that every promotion scheme in Ireland is different in the Irish university system, and some universities, for example Cork, they cap the number of places. And you can, in those circumstances, you can then put in gender quotas. But where you've simply got a criterion-based scheme, as we do here, then if somebody's meeting the criteria, they must get the promotion. What we can do is monitor the numbers as to whether, in fact, it starts skewing in one direction rather than the other. But I'm happy to take whatever advice is out there and learn from what other institutions have done. If they have indeed corrected it, I'm not sure that many of them have, to be honest. But we can certainly try and avoid those pitfalls in any way, and I'm happy to take any advice in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ursula. So Michael Lang is asking, if an applicant goes for EP but doesn't quite make the cut, could he or she be deemed to have met the standard for AP and be promoted to that grade? No,
it's a separate application. You decide what grade you think you're meeting and you apply, and you either get it or you don't. Under no circumstances will a lower grade be regarded as a consolation prize in a promotion scheme.
Okay, and Michael has added here that he's unclear as to what exactly halfway between SL and EP means. EP needs to hit 10 out of 10 criteria. So is this the case for AP?
So it's actually 9 criteria for EP, and it will be 9 criteria. So it's based on the same structure as the EP application. But for example, where we can measure things, and if you look at the guidelines, there are numbers of publications in high quality outlets that are required for SL and EP level at the moment. So where it's a simple numerical thing like that, it will be exactly halfway between. Other things, it will be in the academic judgment of the panel as to whether in fact someone is exceeding the SL and meeting the standard that we will discuss. Just to say that our guidelines, by the way, and I did some research, as you can see, not just on salaries, but also on guidelines in preparation for this presentation. But the guidelines that we have here in Galway are far more advanced than anything that's in any other Irish university at the moment. But it can never be simply a formula.
Okay, and on criteria there, Ursula Connolly's come back in. What will the criteria be for associate professor? We've seen document via the union which uses the term outstanding as the benchmark. Is that what is proposed?
Yeah, so that is the adjective that is used consistently in the UCD scheme, which we lent on heavily when we introduced the new scheme here in Galway, that it's substantial at SL level, outstanding at AP level, and exceptional at PP-EP level. So that is the intention, that we would use that same terminology.
Okay, thanks for that. Niamh Riley is asking in this proposal for personal professors who opt not to apply for established professor, do they remain personal professors? Sorry.
Yes, they do. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, next one in there is Margaret Hodgins. It seems EP and PP are now being referred to as full professor. I'm guessing that's a question, or is that correct?
Yes, Paul? Yes. One of the things that we have done in our statistical reporting to the HEA over the years is we have reported the personal professor as equivalent to associate professor. You can see from the salary scales that actually the personal professor here is 40 grand more than the start of the associate professor grade and 20 grand higher than the top of the associate professor grade. So it has been a false equivalency. Our personal professor grade is a full professorship. And we're the only university that has that distinction between the EP and PP. So whilst people who have already achieved a PP absolutely retain it, we are proposing that going forward, we will no longer have that distinction and that we will simply fall into line with the rest of the sector. But yes, a PP is a full professorship.
Okay, thanks. Lucy-Anne Buckley is asking if there's a change in the leadership requirements for EP. This seems very unfair to those who are previously going for PP on the leadership track. They can't go for the AP as no leadership track for that, and that they have a higher standard to meet for EP.
So it will be a very slightly higher standard, but frankly, everybody that's gone for personal professor so far has shown significant leadership when they have got it, when they have got the PP. So I don't see that as a massive obstacle. The other thing to note, by the way, is that there has been a recommendation from the external assessors in their report on the external members of the promotions panel, in their report on the first 2 rounds of the promotions, that actually where someone is sufficiently strong across the piece, but perhaps falling down slightly on one criterion, that they be promoted anyway if the panel is satisfied that in fact in the round it should happen. Now that's a change to the scheme that we hope to agree with the unions, but that would address that if anyone felt that somehow or other the bar was being raised. It would be raised a little bit, not by much, on the leadership piece, but actually if we can get the agreement with the unions on that, then that would address that for anyone that was going for EP under the new scheme.
Okay, Margaret has come back in to say, yet it is required that PPs apply to become EPs. Why is this if they are both full professors?
Yeah, and that is to do with pensions, and Josephine might be the one to answer that actually.
Yeah, so whilst we have always used the PP in our promotion scheme, when we go out to advert for established professors, we do put, it is a scale that goes out there. So it's a historical piece. So there will be significant move further up the scale. But if somebody was already a PP and they wished to move on to the EP scale, then they would go through the process similar to others who would be moving on to a scaled process, because to do otherwise would have to just move everybody over, would be seen then as probably a promotion scheme without any activity behind it, either a competition or a promotion process. So hence you'd have to go through the promotion process, and you know, I don't know, but I would imagine that most individuals at PP would be at a significant level, so that, you know, if they wish to go to EP, they wouldn't have, it wouldn't be as high a bar as somebody going from an SL to an EP that might arise in those circumstances.
I mean, it's not about the standards, it's about the simple fact that they are differential pay scales, and the EP one goes higher, and therefore to simply transfer people across would be effectively giving them a pay rise onto a different scale without going through proper procedure. So, I mean, the advice that we've had from government, and remember, the pension pot actually is owned by government. The advice that we've had there is that we can't do that.
Sorry, I was just going through some questions there to see if I can group them together. And there's a question there on the timeline, but I think Paul has given that already, so we've already dealt with that. And we have some responses given live there as well into the text. Lindsay Ann Reid is asking, I am American and a product of the North American higher education system. I'm very concerned about the proposed equivalences, especially the use of assistant professor to cover lectures above the bar. This title in a North American context specifically is used for pre-tenured academic staff who are in the first 6 years of works. This is not a good equivalence for lecturers above the bar. It would signal strongly to North American colleagues that lecturers above the bar are at a decidedly junior status. So Paul, you might want to.
Yeah, and that has been pointed out by a couple of other people as well, and perhaps I should have put it into the presentation. So the way that UCD responded to that was they made it entirely optional for lecturers above and below the bar to use the assistant professor, exactly on those grounds, Lindsay, that it is a pre-tenured position in the US. Now, if you look, if anybody has been following the news will have noted that academics from UCD and one or two other places have been listed on prime time and also on news items and so on as assistant professor UCD, assistant professor of whatever. So I think the proposal there is that it would be optional. But look, the use of these titles, I think for anybody that's currently in post, nobody's going to be forced to use it, but it would become an option. But I think the intention would be for new contracts that we would actually issue them under the American titles then, if this is approved by referendum. But exactly that point, Lindsay, has been raised, hence the optionality of it.
Great, thanks, Paul. Michael Madden is asking here, he's saying, so if he understands correctly, established professor is not currently a promotional grade. They're only filled by external appointment. Will this now become a promotional grade? Good question.
That's correct, yes. So as established professor will now become a promotional grade. Yeah.
Great. Karen Bacon is saying she doesn't really have a question, but as long as American titles are optional, I don't see an issue. I certainly won't be using assistant professor. I think it's a dreadful title. Okay, thanks, Karen. Rachel Cave, is there no move across the NUI to make a common system across the NUI? Surely better than for NUI Galway to go it alone, even though it brings us a bit closer to our sister universities.
So I think if you look at the scales that I presented there, they are broadly similar, and we are the outlier in having a PP but no AP. I think you do need to remember the concept of institutional autonomy, though. You know, we have a certain amount of autonomy around the titles that we use. What we don't really have is autonomy in the salary scales, because they have pension implications and the state owns the pensions. But I mean, look, should it be a single system across all the universities? I think that would just provide another lever for the state to stick its oar in even more than it already does in higher education in this country. So I'd be wary of that, to be brutally honest.
Okay, from Dara Cannon, how will these align to the HR competency framework, which has 3 levels, current SL levels meeting the middle and the EP in the top? How will this be adapted to squeeze AP in? Maybe Josephine, you might want to take that.
We would have to go back and adjust them, because we would be recruiting at that level then. So we'd have to go back in a similar way that if this was introduced for the promotion scheme and introduced for recruiting, that we would have to adjust them. That's, you know, that will be just, you know, a formality for us to do once this would be progressing and moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Josephine. Dan Carey's coming in to say, Paul, that we need to have live contributions. The issues are too complex to lend themselves to simple questions.
I'm not sure if we can set that up, Dan. Dave, even, sorry.
And just moving on to the next one, Margaret, we've been out of sync with other universities for some time. Why are we only doing this now? It was recommended in the Grimson Report 2015. So I'm just reading those out, just so in case you can't see them all there, Paul and Josephine.
I suppose, Paul, if I just come in here, I suppose, you know, we tried to get the promotion scheme back up and running as a first start, you know, and that took a considerable period of time. I would say it probably took nearly the first year and a half of me being into the university, at least anyways. And we wanted to get that so that it would work. And I think we are actually seeing that, you know, whilst not everybody will be happy with everything, I think we've tried to meet the criteria that we had worked a long period of time to try and get. I suppose this is probably the next step. And it's the next step where we've started, you know, that we've continued the conversation with our union stakeholders to try and get to the next level by looking at A, the introduction of the AP, and B, the titles. And I can see in the conversations that's coming through, Michelle, while some people have reservations about the American titles, others are saying that when people apply for posts, they're asking how does it equate to, you know, other titles used, you know, and I know they're American titles, but they can be used quite widely around the world as well. So I do think, you know, there will be good and bad with lots of things in terms of introducing titles and the reflection. But I think if we want to be competitive out there as well in an international market, we probably, you know, if our titles are causing confusion to international applicants and where do they land in terms of the equivalence, I think then we should be looking at advertising such posts into the future, if we have the agreement, advertising that shows the Irish market, because they would understand lecture above the bar, below the bar, and those contexts. And we should also show the equivalence that would be at a standard that might be more recognisable in the international market. I know they might not be perfect, but certainly I think in looking at the questions coming in and the comments coming in, Michelle, there certainly is for and against. And I do think we just need to see where we sit internationally, because if we're putting stuff out there that people don't understand, and look, lecture below the bar isn't a nice term either, because it's certainly confusing for people. But I do think that we need to kind of do something that makes us look. But in answering to Margaret's questions, I suppose, Margaret, we were trying to do things incrementally. So we got the promotion scheme, which I think was important for people, particularly who hadn't had an opportunity at maybe SL level to apply for promotion, for people to apply for promotion to SL level. And I think, you know, it was important that we got that up and running first. Just one other comment that I'd like to make, and the fact that, you know, with this title being in other universities, it puts not alone our promotion scheme out of sync, it puts our retention scheme out of sync as well. So if somebody is offered a position at that particular AP equivalent level in another university, we don't have anything that, so I suppose it goes back to one of the questions earlier, if somebody missed the bar in a promotion scheme, we have the potential of people missing this level in our retention in terms of an application that will come in, and in that instance, you know, we don't have anything to put it up against because we don't have the equivalent in the university at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Josephine, for that. Michael Dinity in here is saying, if you're unsuccessful in an application from SL to established professor, can you be granted associate professor, or are there going to be separate application processes?
No, I think we already had that question. No, I mean, you apply for a grade and you get judged against that grade, assessed against that grade by the promotions committee. There's no, you didn't quite make it to this level, but you can have this level instead. That's not how the promotion scheme works. Not in any university that I'm aware of.
Okay, thanks. And Gary Galander's here. The application for assistant professor to lecture above the bar, below the bar, except perhaps for below the bar on probation, is out of line with the use of the title in North America. And you might have dealt with this, where it applies to untenured academics in the first few years of their employment. Adoption of this could impact staff interaction.
Yeah, so that's the question that came from Lindsay. Yeah. I mean, just to say, colleagues, I'm not recommending the adoption of American titles to anyone. This is on the table simply because I've been approached by many people over the last number of years, and others within our academic community here in Galway have suggested that it would be really beneficial to them in their interactions with North America to be able to use those American titles, that our titles actually don't mean very much in that context. So we're simply deciding to put it on the table for the academics themselves to determine, do you want to have this option or do you not? Okay, but it's not a recommendation from management. It's to vote yay or nay. It's entirely up to academics themselves. But we are being given the option in response to it being repeatedly raised over the last number of years by some people that it would be desirable for them.
Okay, thank you. Dara Cannon, what evidence supports the mention of this being a positive for gender equality progression here at NUI Galway?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the evidence is. I just know that it did come up at the Equality Committee, and that it was included then in the successful Athena Swan bronze submission 3 or 4 years ago. So I would have to go back and get the precise details of that. But certainly it is a commitment that we gave in the Athena Swan in 2017 that we would be, or 2018 when we made the submission, that we would seek that we would introduce this grade. So we're really just fulfilling the promise that we made then. Okay.
Okay, and leading on from that, Mary Dempsey is asking, given the current pipeline, what impact will a new grade have on the pay gap, please? Has the data been prospectively analysed? So I don't
well, it's hard to prospectively analyse if you don't have any idea what numbers will actually get this grade. So, and I certainly don't have the resources in my office to model this. I mean, the driver here is essentially what I said, that this was in the Athena Swan commitment, and also the fact that we are simply out of sync with the rest of the Irish sector. And you know, the reasons that Josephine outlined. And it's not just the Irish sector, by the way. So the equivalent grade in the UK sector is Reader, which sits between senior lecturer and full professor in the UK grade. And again, if someone gets offered a readership in the UK, and that has happened in this university in the last year or two, we actually can't offer an equivalent grade here in order to retain them. So there, you know, this is a potential loss to our academic community, that we cannot actually offer this to people as part of their pathway through their academic career, or indeed as a measure to retain some very good staff. So, but I mean, in terms of measuring the pay gap, we'll only know that when we have numbers on this salary grade.
Okay, Molly Byrne is asking how many PPs are there in NUI Galway. I don't know if we have that to hand right now, but assuming that most, if not all, apply for EP as the criteria are the same, is there a risk that the Academic Promotions Committee will not have the capacity to review all of these applications in the next?
Yeah, that's a good question. If all of them apply at the same time, then it would certainly slow down the work of the Promotions Committee. But you know what, we will cross that bridge when we come to it. I would hope that they would stagger it a little bit. But if the promotions round then ends up dragging out and delaying the next round because of that, because of capacity issues, then we'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it. I think we've got something in the region of 60-something personal professors in the university, if I'm not mistaken.
We can come back on the exact figure, Michelle. I just don't have it at hand, but we can come back on the exact figure.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Dara's back. Dara Cannon back in. I think we've already had this question. How will we align to HR competency framework? I think
Yeah.
you've answered that already, Josephine.
Yeah.
So I think that's covered. Rachel Hilliard is asking, how will outstanding be operationalised?
Yeah, I mean, look, in the same way that the others have been operationalised, that substantial and exceptional have been operationalised, the Academic Promotions Committee, which consists exclusively, apart from 2 ex officio members, namely myself and the VP Research, consists exclusively of professorial level academics. So it will be operationalised where we can measure things, as I said earlier, and the guidelines do indicate the numbers of publications expected, or the numbers of PhD completions that are expected. And we've said that exceptional, therefore, is twice what substantial is for full professorial level, and therefore associate professor will sit halfway between. The rest of it will be, as in any promotion scheme anywhere in the world, it will be the academic judgment of the panel. We will expect a higher level of performance than at senior lecturer level, but we will not expect someone going for associate professor or whatever we call it, probably professor, especially if we adopt the American grades, which I don't take to be a foregone conclusion, by the way, but it will sit simply between. That will be the judgment of the academic panel.
Okay, thank you. Gary Galanders is just asking for additional comment here on continuing on the assistant professorial academics they contact with when trying to set up research links, for example. Okay, sorry, Gary, stumbled over that at the start. The existence of an equivalence could be damaging for lecture above the bar college lecturer here, irrespective of whether they use the title.
Well, look, that's for academics to vote on, one way or the other. You know, as I say, I'm not recommending the adoption of American titles. No one in management is. What we're doing is consulting on it and giving the academics the final say.
Okay. Tom Acton back in. Will there be equity of routes for Type A academics?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Lucianne Buckley, when you say that the criteria for EP will be the same as the current criteria for PP, will the same number of criteria also apply? Currently have to meet a particular number of criteria, but some element of choice. Will this number change for EP?
No, it's the same. It's the same.
Okay. Eilish Dowd, my perhaps flawed understanding was that the established professor was the chair of the discipline and that therefore they could only be in each discipline. So with this new scheme, there can be multiple EPs in a discipline. What happens to the traditional chair role?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. The traditional chair role disappeared when the departments disappeared about 10 or 12 years ago, where the established professor was God in his own little fiefdom, and it was usually his own little fiefdom. So we have already got more than one established professor in disciplines, and it will simply become a promotional grade. But the traditional notion of the chair went out when the departments went out and were replaced by schools.
Okay, Manuel is asking, how do staff transfer between SL and AP salary scales?
Say that again, what's the question?
It's moving from one scale to another, Paul. So,
right,
I mean, we do this all of the time in terms of the promotion scheme that currently runs. So, you know, you kind of go over to a point on the next scale higher than the one you're on. So you don't go over at a lower point, you go over at a higher point. So there was some concern or worry, I think, in our last meeting with the unions that people would be less well off. It has never been the case that anybody who's moved to promotional grade in any grade that I've seen that has moved from one grade to a higher grade has been financially less well off. So there's always a process, and the same process will apply in this as it has in all other of the other schemes that we've applied so far.
Okay, thanks, Josephine. Dan Carey just has a few here together, so I'm just going to put them in together. It seems clear that it's imposing a huge burden on PPs to make a full promotional application to be regarded, regraded apologies, at what is not even going to be called an EP, and also asking why Trinity have a higher starting salary level for the equivalent or below the bar. We should have this higher starting level. And also optional does not make sense. This needs to be a system-wide decision. So there's just a few things in there from Dan. So the optional query, I suppose, is related to the vote.
Okay, so look, there's a couple of different questions there. I can't really speak to the lecture below the bar grades at Trinity, and I don't really propose to muddle the introduction of the AP with all of those other questions about why there are slight differences between all the universities at lecture below the bar or above the bar or whatever, because that's really not what this briefing is about, and that may be a separate discussion. I don't get the point that it's not being called EP. It is. If a personal professor wishes to apply for established professor, then they apply for established professor and they will be called established professor. Okay. And what was the third? I've forgotten what the third point was.
Just about the option, so that the titles will be optional as opposed to a system-wide decision.
Yeah, and that's a good question. So, and maybe we'll have a two point. So I think they'll be optional for anyone who's currently on a contract. But then we would, if it's approved, then the new contracts would be under the new titles.
So I think, Michelle, it goes back to what Paul had said at the outset, that, you know, we weren't going to change anybody's contracts right now. So I think there's a difference between staff who are currently employed by us or employed at a particular grade, and those in terms of if we were to adopt the new titles, that in the future we would advertise them and the person would come in at that particular grade. Okay, and we can put in that it's the equivalent to. And now if we don't adopt them, we can also always put in the equivalent to whatever in the international context. Okay, so I mean, you know, as Paul has already said, we're not saying that we want definitely to have the American titles. We're just trying to respond to some, I suppose, information, comments, suggestions that has come from academic staff themselves, that when they're mixing or conferences with others, that the titles are a little bit confusing. Okay, so I mean, it's, you know, the titles are, from our perspective, it's immaterial as to whether people want to adopt them or not. It is just we were showing what is out there, what others are using, and that we don't want to we don't want to be kind of shoving this down people's throat that you must change the title. That's why we're leaving it as optional. And if people want to adopt them, that's fine. But that if we're going to introduce them, that we would try and then start to recruit to those titles in the future. But existing staff, if they wish to continue to use the title that they were recruited to, then that would be something we're happy to let people decide that.
So, Josephine, should the vote come back and those that are voting wish to adopt the new title system, are you saying then that we will have both systems in operation, or do we take it from the vote that we will change it? I think that's the optional maybe query in this.
Yeah, I suppose, look, if an overwhelming majority came back that the majority of people want to adopt them, then by people's own decisions, they will adopt them, okay, themselves, and they will choose to change them. They may also decide to change their title, but use the other intermittently, that, you know, in the context of, you may use the title, or you might have both titles, so that you don't cause any confusion. But I can get the point that, like, there is definitely, you can see it coming through in the comments and questions, there is definitely two, centers of thought in regard to, people who really want it because there's confusion out there, and people who may have experienced the titles and the connotation that they have in the US around the tenure or no tenure. But I think our advertisements and our posts will be very clear whether they're permanent or not, okay? Which is probably a bigger issue that we need to look at in terms of why aren't some of our posts that we put up permanent? Why are they fixed term or whatever? But I do think we need to have them in the context that they are, if we're putting up posts and have a permanent, regardless of the title, the word permanent, I think in the Irish context, would be very different to the non-tenured post in the US. And I think there is very different employment legislation that applies in both jurisdictions. So I do think that, you know, the title is one, but other, you know, when people are applying for a post, it's really that they may not understand where that post sits within the context of, you know, where they are and the post that's being advertised. So it really is a school of thought. I understand where Dan is coming from in regard to, you know, it's either we adopt it or we don't. But I think it's really about giving people choice, and that has been, you know, the position that I think UCD adopted, and Paul, you might know that a little bit better. But when they introduced, and there was a decision taken that they would introduce the American titles, it wasn't forced down that people had to overnight change their titles, but people have adopted them over time. So just
yeah.
Okay, quite a lot of questions coming in here now. So Ursula Connolly is asking, would it be possible to have a question on a leadership track for AP to be asked? So that's us asking it, I guess.
So at the moment, the proposal is there wouldn't be a leadership track at AP any more than there is at SL, that would be reserved for full established professor. I'm open to suggestions in that regard, but I do think that really part of what we're expecting is that people who expect to be full professorial level should be, you know, that the leadership track should be at full professorial level.
Okay, thank you. And I think that has been, there's a question there from Dara Cannon on the evidence of equality. I think we've answered that already, Dara. Patricia Scully, I echo the concerns about being an assistant professor. In a UK Russell Group university, a lecturer could be promoted to senior lecturer after getting a substantial grant and graduating one PhD student as main supervisor. You will simply not get UK applicants at mid-career to NUI Galway. It is too confusing. So I think that's a statement, perhaps more than a question. Sharon would also like to see a live discussion via Blackboard similar to Academic Council instead of this type of forum. Thanks, Sharon. Rachel Cave, issue with autonomy means it's very confusing for any from abroad hoping to apply to a university in Ireland. Better to have a common system, so would strongly encourage you to bring this up at NUI.
I can certainly mention it at NUI. I have no objection to that. Just to say that actually compared to a lot of systems, the Irish system is actually relatively homogenous. I mean, you know, even if I think of the UK system, they have things like senior lecturer, principal lecturer, which you know, lecturer, junior lecturer. They don't have a bar. I've never heard that. That seems to be unique to the Irish system. And then readers, which some places have and some places don't. The Irish system in the broad scheme of things is relatively homogenous. We are the outlier with the personal professor grade. Okay.
Mike McCormack has a comment in here. You might have read it. Difficult to explain this, but here goes. As an artist, as opposed to an academic in full employment at the university, I found that the application forms for promotion to SL were of no relevance. Pages and pages of them were asking me for things I had no experience in as an artist. So it seems that while the university wants to employ artists, it has no pathway for these artists to get promotion. So.
And that's an interesting intervention from Mike, and I think it's something that I'll take up offline. I'm not sure that would have wide application, to be honest, in a forum like this, but certainly if he makes a valid point that if we are interested in employing artists, then we need to look and make sure that there are promotional pathways available as well.
Okay, thank you. And thanks, Mike. George Hurley's asking, in advance of the referendum next week, can we suggest the advantages and disadvantages of both are outlined, as the timeline is very short?
I can try and put that together on the back of the discussion today, and if anybody has any thoughts around the advantages and disadvantages and could forward them, I'm going to volunteer you here, Orla. Actually forward them to the Academic Promotions Scheme, Academic Promotions website, email, sorry. Then we'll try and compile those as pros and cons in advance of opening the vote next week. Yeah, that's a reasonable request.
Okay, that's great. Karen, if saying if we want the American titles because it might be helpful with interacting globally, why is the cut for AP made at senior lecturer and not a lecturer above the bar? In the UK, associate professor is more equivalent to lecturer above the bar in many, including many Russell groups. Why make the AP cut so high?
So I don't think they have lecturer above the bar in the UK. I think that's a unique Irish structure. And I will certainly check whether people who are lecturers, as in below the level of senior lecturer in the UK system, since that's what's being referenced here, are being given the possibility of calling themselves associate lecturer. That would then lump lecturer above the bar and senior lecturer in together under the one title, which may or may not be desirable. But I can certainly investigate that. Look, what I've been proposing so far is based on what was done at UCD. And there is the international dimension, but there's also the comparability in the Irish system that is a question for us. So I look at the rest of the Irish sector first, and then see whether there's anything in the UK system or others that have adopted American style titles that contradicts perhaps what's being done in Ireland before putting the final proposal forward.
Okay, thanks. Now, I know you've already spoken about the timeline earlier, Paul, but this is an additional comment or question from Catherine Emerson. When the current promotion scheme for PP was introduced, the university undertook that it wouldn't change for a full cycle to give potential applicants stable benchmarks to aim for. This proposal would bring in a change after 18 months. Is there a pressing reason to make this change in August?
So it brings in an additionality rather than a change. There is no substantial change to anything that is already in the system. From that point of view, it's an additional target to aim at rather than a changing of the existing targets. As I say, there's a minor tweaking of the leadership piece, but we're also talking to the unions to make sure that actually for anybody that's really good enough, that wouldn't be an obstacle, because you could then fall down on one criterion if you were good enough in the round. So I understand the point, but I don't think we're actually changing. We're not, in fact, I know that we're not substantially changing anything that's already in the system. That remains the same.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Giuseppe Zurlo coming in here saying, just to echo Lindsay's comment, the Italian system is exactly as the American one, 3 levels, professor, associate professor, assistant professor, 3 years tenure. So this confirms that also in Italy, associate professor is a junior status. And I think you've spoken to that already. And
that might be a typo. I think he means that assistant professor is a junior title. Yeah, look, the introduction of American titles is fraught, colleagues, and there are all sorts of non-equivalencies there, no matter what way you cut it. But the only reason this is on the table is because a lot of staff here in Galway have suggested we should do it. And instead of saying, no, we're too busy doing other things, we just decided we put this on the table for academics themselves to decide.
Okay, just going back to comment from Josephine from you earlier, Lucianne Buckley is saying that you referred to the changing of the competency criteria after the new grade is introduced, but it is not clear what this would involve. Surely this should be settled before the new grade is adopted, not after.
We can do that before. It's just doing, we can absolutely do that because we would have to make the change anyways for the promotion scheme. So we can absolutely do that. That's no problem.
Thanks, Josephine. Just going back to any questions I've missed here. Dara Cannon, just on the gender equality, again, I think Real Risk here is doing this now in our context of our stage of rectification of gender bias. The new level will remunerate lower than PP so that the total proportion of females at SL now will remain this. Will mean this slows our recovery towards equality down further. Not sure.
I'm not sure I understand the point. I mean, I think there are equality reasons that the Equality Committee has elaborated and our Athena Swan submissions have elaborated for doing this rather than for not doing it. And just to be clear again, no one is required to go for the new grade. If you're a senior lecturer and you want to go for full professor, you still go for full professor. You simply skip over the grade. That's one of the innovations after years and years of everyone being required to be in the university for about 93 years and have been at the top of the senior lecturer grade for about 120 of those 93. You can now simply apply for the grade that you feel that you are meeting the criteria for at any stage in your career. You only have to have been in the university 3 years, but after that, it's at any stage. So I don't see this as an additional obstacle. I see it as an additional opportunity, but it certainly isn't a barrier for anybody.
Okay, Manuela asking, what are the union's perspectives on the new grade and where are negotiations currently? So I can put that to either of you.
So we've had a number of meetings with the unions in regard to it. They have similar questions, queries to what are coming in here today. I suppose what we're trying to do is trying to be very clear that this is not removing anything from the promotion scheme. This is actually putting a new grade in. And I think, you know, for some people, they may see the jump from SL to established professor as a big jump. This gives an opportunity in between, but it doesn't put a barrier from anybody going from an SL to an established professor. It just means that there's an option that if people want to take that, I'll move from one to the next and then on. So I think it's an option that's there. It's a possibility for individuals. And I don't think that, and I certainly would like anybody to leave here today thinking that we're putting a barrier in the way, because we're not. The promotion scheme is quite advanced insofar as you do not need to go from A to B to C. You can go from A to C if you feel. If if that's the, if you feel that you meet the criteria for established professor, then by all means we would be saying, why would you go for an AP in between? But it does give the option for somebody who wishes to use it. So the negotiations are ongoing. All I would say is, Manuela, this just doesn't apply to the promotion scheme. This also applies to the retention scheme. And without divulging any confidentiality, we are seeing that without this grade, people are losing out from a retention perspective, both males and females. Okay, this is not just a male issue, that there are male and female applicants who come through retention from time to time, who may be offered a post that we don't have an equivalent of. So insofar as it does have implications across both the promotion scheme and the retention scheme, but this is an addition rather than us taking something out of the promotion scheme.
Okay, thanks, Josephine. A query in here, how does this new grade apply for clinical academics on PP grade? These are paid at associate professor grade currently under the agreed contract, but will now technically be a grade above AP. So
I suppose these are often joint appointments between ourselves and the HSE. So the associate professor grade is actually a HSE salary scale which we apply, rather than a university salary scale, because we've gone, myself and Paul have gone through this already in terms of somebody who's queried this previously. So we would have to look at those, but the associate professor grade that's referred to in the query there for Michael is in regard to a HSE salary scale. So if you click into the HSE salary scales, you will see it there, and that's what's aligned because that's what's advertised in the joint appointment. So we would have to go back and see how we would clarify that, but the joint appointment from the advert comes from the HSE scale, which is advertised through the HSE at the time rather than advertised through it's much higher, as are the clinical scales that our clinical academics are appointed on. So it's not that we would be taking somebody down into a scale. It's what that person has been recruited into through a joint appointment with the university and the health service. So the associate professor grade that's referred to in that question relates to the HSE scale, which talks about professor or associate professors in terms of clinical appointments.
One thing we could do, given that all the other universities have already got associate professorships and several of them have also got medical schools, is we could simply consult with them and how that has played out with them, and try and follow that tack, or indeed, if we don't think it's right, perhaps try and do something new, something different. But we are conscious of it. Okay,
thanks. So just a clarification here. So if this goes ahead, we will have EP, PP and AP, 3 titles, then SL and lecturer above the bar, below the bar.
That's correct, but there would be no further appointments at PP level. Okay, so what we would have is 5 currently achievable grades, which would be EP, AP, although we may not call it AP, because if we adopt the American titles, then senior lecturer is AP. But effectively using the old traditional terminology, here we'd have EP, AP, SL, lecturer above the bar and lecturer below the bar.
Okay. Niamh Riley's asking, does the established professor grade currently have a statutory definition that distinguishes it from other academic grades in any way?
That I don't know. I don't know what a statutory definition of the established professor would be in those terms.
I don't know what's I don't know what, if Niamh could maybe elaborate on the statutory definition, that would be helpful. I just don't understand the question. Apologies.
Niamh, you might, if you can, in the comments or the Q&A, put in a further question, perhaps that might help. Maeve Duffy, in the planned referendum on moving to the American titles, would it make sense to include an option to change only one of the NUI Galway titles, for example, the SL to AP title, where there are less issues relating to equivalence with American and other Irish universities?
Well, I think the way UCD dealt with that is they made it optional. So look, I think the request has been put there, and I think it would be unfair for us to turn around and say, you know what, we're going to allow senior lecturers to choose the American titles, but we're not going to allow anybody else to choose American titles. So instinctively, I suppose my initial reaction is I think it should be there as an option for everyone.
Okay.
But I'll reflect on that over the next day or two. Just to say, and there was a question there from Ursula, I wanted to hold this briefing first, but an email will go out in the next day or two then, notifying you of the referendum. It will open in the middle of next week, and it will be open for a week, okay, for people to vote, to log in and vote.
Okay. That's great. Ursula also commenting there that she would argue that a leadership track at AP level should be introduced, given the importance of leadership when a full professor.
And that's an interesting point, and I'll certainly bring that to UMT for discussion next Tuesday to see whether, in fact, that is something that we should be doing.
And Dan McCary also commenting on that, saying confidential submissions about the merits of a leadership track system should be invited.
Okay.
Thanks, Dan. Jane Walsh, currently if someone applies for PP and is unsuccessful, they are required to wait 2 years before reapplying. Does failure to achieve PP preclude an application for AP in the interim?
Yes. So, I mean, if you apply for a post, and we put this in specifically because of the workload issues around the panel itself, to preempt, and this would be the norm, that if someone hasn't met the criterion, that they'd be expected to then add substantially to it, and normally they would do that after 2 years. Now, and that's about the workload for the panel itself, that it doesn't end up being used as effectively the dry run for a promotions thing to get all the feedback and then they go again 6 months later. I think we've got, and aside from the two ex officio people, the VP Research and myself, for whom I have no sympathy, the 14 academics who are on the panel are there as academics, giving of their time when they could quite possibly be doing productive research or other things, to consider bona fides applications. And I think that they need therefore to be bona fides applications and not a kind of, I'll chance my arm at this level, I'll get the feedback and then I'll go at this level. I think that would be not the way to use a proper promotion scheme. So the 2 years will remain in place. What I had been putting to the unions before the report from the external assessors came was that if someone fell down on a single criterion, they would be able to apply after 1 year rather than be held to 2 years. So we're meeting with the union shortly, but actually the latest proposal that has come from the externals is that if someone is falling down on a single criterion but deemed good enough in the round by the panel, that they would then be promoted anyway, so they wouldn't have to wait 1 year. And that's something that we will seek agreement with the unions on. I think that would be a positive step, but as yet it hasn't been agreed. And I think we're scheduled to meet them at the Workplace Relations Commission, which was all part of the original plan anyway, sometime in July. Josephine, can you perhaps mention that?
Yeah, so we have We'd always given a commitment to the, when we introduced the promotion scheme, that we would review it under the auspices of the WRC. So we now have a date in the diary that suits everybody to actually move that, to start, commence that review, and look at the issues that, you know, and it's from the number of rounds that we've already had. So we'll review some of the feedback and kind of address some of the kind of where people feel that we need to put more supports in, or where issues have, you know, are areas where we feel we're not getting enough applications. They were the kind of things that we did talk about at the beginning of the promotion scheme. They were the concerns that were, so we'll go back and we'll try and address all of those that we can.
Okay, thank you. Just a few comments here before another question. Anthony Grehan is saying that having the optional American system running alongside our own system will lead to much confusion, in his opinion. Brian Tobin is saying that assistant professor is an inappropriate title for highly research active lecturers above the bar. Mary Dempsey asking, can keeping the PP grade be considered?
Except that the criteria are effectively the same as for the EP. There's a minor difference there, so there's no logic around running the two in parallel. You know, PP is EP.
Okay, that's a few asking about notice of the referendum, but Paul has already addressed that an email will be going out detailing everything you will be asked to vote on and the details of same. So that'll be going out. Will it be this week, Paul?
Orla, the notification, when is that scheduled to go out? I think you've sent me a draft of it, haven't you? So we'll possibly meet tomorrow.
So and the next few days.
This week, Paul,
this week anyway. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Tom Fell agreeing with the comments on leadership track for AP. Thank you, Tom. And Dan Carey is agreeing with Mike, this needs to be addressed. And Mike McCormick, I presume plenty of UK precedent exists. Okay, that's useful, thank you. Rachel Cave, title of lecture below the bar caused much hilarity among my UK colleagues when I moved here, as associated in their mind with drunken Irish stereotype. Thanks, Rachel. Martin Kieran, it was suggested in an answer that all new appointments would be appointed under the American title. This doesn't sound like an optional system and will lead to much confusion.
Yeah, so it certainly sounds like the debate is very much around the titles. And I just hope people don't lose sight of the two issues that we were chatting about today. Look, the titles, as Paul has mentioned from the outset, it's been put out there because a lot of staff have been coming to us saying that it is causing, and you will see in the chat, and we'll go back through the chat and the questions and answers that have been coming in. There are people who feel that the titles cause confusion when they're dealing with other colleagues around the world. Okay, now in itself, is that a right reason to adopt another, you know, titles changes? Yeah, I don't know. But we certainly felt that it was important that we listened to what staff were asking us and put it out there. At the end of the day, whether if we adopt them or we don't adopt them, you know, for me certainly it's not the most, you know, important thing. But for me, from a HR perspective, but I do think if people feel strongly that the titles don't reflect, you know, out there, and they would like to adopt them, then that's an option for people to choose. It is going to be confusing. What I was trying to point out, that, you know, that we would leave it to existing staff, that we weren't going to change their contracts, to change the titles of their contracts, but that I think if people were coming in and we were putting it on the advertisement going out that we would be recruiting to that grade, then, and that will be the title the person will be coming into. So it's differentiating between existing staff and new staff that we would recruit to under those in the future.
Okay. Jane Walsh has come back. I think Paul has answered this, but I'll just double check a related question to my earlier one. If someone applies and is successful at AP, how long must they wait before applying for PPEP or EP?
24 hours. Or, the next deadline.
Not even.
Not even. The next deadline.
Yeah.
If you're successful in promotion, then you can apply to the next deadline straight away.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Tom Acton is saying, if PP equals EP, why do PPs need to apply for a promotion to an EP?
And I think I did answer that earlier. It's because of pension entitlements. It's a higher pay scale. So academically, it's equivalent. And that's one of the oddities about NUI Galway, that we have something that's academically equivalent, but on a different pay scale. And because the EP goes higher in the pay scale, it attracts higher pension rights, etc., etc. And from the point of view of DPER, you cannot therefore simply transfer somebody across and give them additional pay and additional salary and additional pension rights without actually going through a proper formal process. It's all down to that.
Okay.
Yeah. So Michelle, I suppose just to come in on what Paul has said there, the government departments, including DPER, are very strong on that people are not, progress to another higher scale without going through a process. So we do have a promotion scheme, a retention scheme, or an advertisement. They would want to see evidence of one of the three of those being utilised in order for somebody to move up. Otherwise, we would be seen to be moving against what will be considered public pay policy, and I don't need to go into all the controversy which was about a Secretary General in a government department recently and all the controversy around the increase in salary. It will be no different in these. We would have to be able to show when we're audited how did that change take place. So from that perspective, there will be the three options.
Okay. Thanks. There's a question there about the format of the referendum, but again, I think that'll all be in the detail, Tina, in the email that will go out from Paul in the next day or two.
Yeah.
Have I missed anything there, colleagues, in terms of, are there any last minute questions that people would like to submit as we're coming up to a few minutes to 1 now?
I suppose, Michelle, just to say that we will go back and go through the Q&As again, just to make sure that we've covered off, and even to take on board anything that's coming in there that we can try and bring clarity to the referendum, or that if we feel that taking on board some of the questions that were coming in, that we could give clarity around the AP role, that we will try and do that.
Yeah, I think that would be very useful.
Yeah, what we're trying to do is to, in terms of the titles, we're trying to just see, if this is what people were asking us for, is this really what people want? Yeah. And in regard to the grade, well, it's bringing us in line with other universities, both here and abroad, in terms of that level, or that kind of grade within the academic that exists elsewhere. What we're trying to do is add something to our structure rather than take something away. And look, if people feel that it's going to undermine something else, we want to hear their comments, but that's not the intention of this. We want to have a very clear promotional route. And I suppose from my perspective, we see other elements that are going on that people, by not having this grade and title, or this grade in between, for want of a better word, we are seeing individuals losing out in terms of some of the other schemes that are there.
Yeah. I mean, one thing to note about the Irish sector, which is quite different to a lot of other countries, and that is that pay is relatively strictly controlled at government level, and it's precisely because of those pension rights and so on. So in the UK and in various other systems, vice chancellors, presidents can come along and say, you know what, there's a super duper researcher, and if I have to pay him an extra 50 grand a year to keep him, I'm going to pay it. And that is at the root of all sorts of pay differentials in UK academia, for example, gender pay differentials that are simply not possible in Ireland, because if you get to a certain level on the pay scale, then this is the pay scale. and there is no gender differential. There is perhaps a catch-up piece where more men have been there longer and therefore they're more likely to be at the top of the scale and so on. But there is no actual pay differential in terms of the men are paid this significant amount more versus women, which often happens in other systems. But that also means that even when we introduce an AP scheme, we can't make up our own pay scale for that. We need to look and see what is the norm in the sector and actually imitate that, so that it's not something that we could just come along and say, yeah, we're going to introduce the AP scale, but we're actually going to introduce our own pay range for it, and it's this much higher or this much whatever than anybody else. That's simply not a possibility, because we're effectively bound by the expectations of DEPA in this regard. Now, as I said, I will investigate why exactly UCC is out of step with the rest of the Irish sector in that regard, but in all likelihood we will have to simply conform to what is the norm in the other universities.
Okay, an important point to make here as well is just that the Q&As will be made available to all those who participated today, because sometimes you can miss some of the replies and they all don't show up straight away once they're published. So just to reassure you that you will all get that. I think that has been confirmed there by the moderator, so thanks very much for that.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, we're at 2 minutes to 1 now, so I think it's time to maybe take a little break.
Well, look, I hope that has been a useful session. Certainly from my perspective, we've had some useful feedback on it, and we will continue to engage with the unions, but there's that very firm intention. It's a university commitment to introduce the associate professor grade. And then in terms of the American titles, I'm utterly agnostic on it. I have to say I can see arguments both ways, and that is why we are following the model of simply asking the academics themselves, what is your preference? So we'll finalize the details of that and communicate before this week is out, but the polling will open in the middle of next week, and it will be open for a week then for people to consider, have discussions and reflect, and we should have the result. I think, Orla, in your draft email to me, you said we'd have the result. Is it within 60 to 90 minutes of the polls closing?
Yes, that's correct.
And I'll communicate that in an email to all academic staff then as soon as we have that. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, everybody, and good luck for the rest of the day.